Hello, everybody. Coming to you live from the rehearsal rooms. So if you occasionally hear music going in the background, that's why. I wonder if there's a way to raise this up somewhere, especially because there's no one else in here yet. Oh, there's one person. Probably gonna put this on top of an amp. No, there we go. I'll put you on top of a pedal board. That'll probably be a better angle once I'm sitting down. All right, perfect. Okay. Yeah, so there might be some random drumming in the background. Might be some, you'll probably just hear drums and bass if you hear anything. Oh, man. Okay. So we're reading the political parties again. And the reason why we've got Napoleon in the preview is because we're going to be talking about Bonapartism, as Michels talks about it. That's the name for it. If I just find the fucking page number, Jesus Christ. Oh yeah, here we go. It's a chapter called Bonapartist Ideology. And yeah, so that'd be fun to talk about Napoleon. I'm going to wait just a minute and see if anyone else pops into the channel. Let's see here. As per usual, no one asked any questions or had any requests of things to talk about, because really nothing's going on in the country at the moment, or in world politics. It's amazing how quickly after Trump disappears that all the news is so boring, because now the media is reflexively has to pretend the people who are in charge are just completely noble-minded and completely they have the best interests at heart. They're professionals, and the good people are in charge now. Yeah. Alrighty. So I guess I'll just start out reading what Michels writes about Napoleon. Napoleon I, as head of the state, desired to be regarded as the chosen of the people. In his public activities, the emperor boasted that he owed his power to the French people alone. After the Battle of the Pyramids, when his glory began to attain its acme, the general imperiously demanded that there should be conferred on him the title of Premier Représentant du Peuple, although hitherto the style of popular representative had been exclusively reserved for members of the legislative bodies. Later, when by a plebiscite he had been raised to the throne of France, he declared that he considered his power to repose exclusively upon the masses. The Bonapartist interpretation of popular sovereignty was a personal dictatorship conferred by the people in accordance with constitutional rules. The Caesarism of Napoleon III was founded in still greater measure upon the principle of popular sovereignty. So Napoleon III, that he brings up there, very interesting character. A lot of people don't know about Napoleon III. Obviously the first Napoleon's much more popular character, but Napoleon III was Napoleon's grandson, who became president and then had himself made emperor and fought against elements that existed in the status quo government on the basis that he was the legitimate heir to the throne of emperor, but also that he was the sort of avatar or representative of the people. And so throughout this chapter on Bonapartist ideology, what Michels kind of establishes here is that there is this, what Bonapartism is this strange melding of the aristocratic, what would you call it? The aristocratic, desire for a king or a monarch, and then the seemingly paradoxical pairing of that with a democratic, egalitarian leader of the masses. That those two things, those two yearnings, are sort of they should be opposed technically, but they're not. That they find their synthesis in the figure of like a Napoleon Bonaparte or a Caesar. And Caesarism typically in the past just meant like autocracy, but I think there's a shift in the understanding of the word, probably starting around the time of Michels, of seeing Caesar as sort of a prototypical dictator of the proletarian, the dictator that speaks for the proletarians, even if it's not a dictatorship of the proletarians, but the man of the people who takes charge and is autocratic because all of the Republican principles and virtues and the constitutional order that was established supposedly for limited government and to maintain freedom, which was, I'm talking about here of ancient Rome. I'm not talking about America, even though it sounds like that. Again, the reason why people like to compare the two. But all of those things were just entrenchments around the caste of patricians who, if you know from studying the Roman system of government, they were an oligarchy. They selected their own members. They were unelected by the people. While there were tribal and popular assemblies, those assemblies are very limited in their power. And one of the things Caesar did was actually to elevate the power of the popular assemblies, to expand the number of people in the Senate, to bring in more people who are not of the traditional birth or bloodlines into the Senate, people even from Gaul, foreigners, but who are Romanized foreigners. Caesar brought them in. Now, that was, I touched on this last time, an attempt to expand Caesar's own power and make it so that Caesar could have a bulwark around him from the other political interests that didn't want Caesar challenging the property relationships that already existed. Because the Roman nobles, they owned like, I think it was like a third of the land in Italy was farmed out in these giant latifundia, these giant plantations that were worked by slave labor. So the ways in which somebody could make a living for themselves if they didn't have any land or property was to be employed as somebody who could do work like harvesting crops. But that was being done for free. I mean, you had to pay the slaves and take care of them, even though they were living under brutality and the yoke of often very cruel masters, the ones who lived in the latifundia. They didn't have to pay them. So there was no competition between the workers and the slave labor force. Or there was no competition because there was no contest. It was obvious that it would be a lot easier to do a lot of the labor by slave labor rather than paying people. And then if you wanted to get into the game of being a smallholder, all these rich nobility were buying up all the land, creating these monopolies. So Caesar went into that and broke that all up. He gave a lot of lands, did a lot of land redistribution programs, and made a lot of lands that were formerly public that had been stolen by the aristocracy, gave them back to the people, and did things of that nature. And so that required him to be autocratic, because there were rules saying you can't do that, and he needed these Senate majorities. And of course, the people who made up the Senate, who would have had to have voted in large majorities for these measures, were the people who owned the land that would be redistributed. So of course they were never going to do that. So that's why Caesar, it's like it originally was just sort of it just meant crude autocracy, Caesarism, but it's come to mean more of like left-wing autocracy. Autocracy done, it's the paradox of the monarch standing for the will of the people. Because left-wing and right-wing, as we know, the origin, which comes from France, which we're now talking about, the left wing stood on one side of the chamber, standing for against the current entrenched power structure of the ancient regime, and the people on the right wing were for preserving the monarchy. And so it's the idea of being for the people or for the monarchy is sort of the original left wing, right wing idea, or for liberalism versus for democracy, or for liberalism and democracy versus monarchy. The idea of a Caesar is the paradox of someone who is standing on both sides. They're for the idea of a monarchy, but a monarchy on behalf of the people. Okay, so then the Caesarism of Napoleon III, even more than the original Napoleon Bonaparte, even more like heightens the contradictions of that, because he's not only laying claim as like a hereditary claim to the throne, but saying, I am the legitimate avatar of the people. And indeed, Michels says, this is on page 212, by the way, at the same time he claimed for himself, and at the expense of the exiled King Louis Philippe, a hereditary right to insurrection and to the throne. This recognition and this claim were derived by him from the same principle. With simultaneous pride and humility, he wrote, quote, in the presence of a king elected by 200 deputies, I could remember that I am the inheritor of an empire founded on the consent of 4 million Frenchmen. In the presence of the national sovereignty, the result of universal suffrage, I can't and don't wish to claim any rights but those of a French citizen, which recalls, of course, the Roman emperor's pretense of merely being the princeps, the first citizen. And indeed, that was the, we get the word emperor from imperator, which is, that meant like sort of like the commander or head of a province, for example. And that was one of the titles that Caesar claimed for himself, and the subsequent Caesars. If you look at their actual names, by the way, we all have like, we'll just talk about like Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius, and Nero, et cetera, et cetera. But these emperors, they all had like a million names. They all had like 12 names. And they usually would, their names were intermixed with titles, and they would have like imperator in there. But the actual title that Augustus claimed for himself was princeps, which is where we get the word prince from, which just simply means first citizen. And we all might remember Animal Farm, George Orwell, all animals are equal, but some are simply more equal than others. This is page 213. With great shrewdness, he continually repeated that he was no more than an instrument, a creature of the masses. While still president, he declared in a speech that he was prepared, as circumstances might dictate, either for abnegation or for perseverance, or in other words, that he was ready to go or to remain. So that's that same thing we were talking about of the leader threatening to resign to show how indispensable he is to the cause, bringing up the idea of I might leave, and where would you be if I left? And so that's another tactic that Napoleon III used. Okay. And yeah, this is what I love about the chapter on Bonapartism, is because it's all about contradictions, which is what the dialectic is about. And so it's very interesting. Bonapartism recognized the validity of the popular will to such an extreme degree as to concede to that will the right of self-destruction. Popular sovereignty could suppress itself. Yet if we look at the matter from a purely human point of view, popular sovereignty is inalienable. Moreover, if we think of succeeding generations, it seems illogical and unjust that those of this generation should claim the moral right of renouncing on behalf of their descendants. Yeah, so this whole thing is sort of based on the idea that by the popular will, you could actually vote to have a Caesar or vote to have a Napoleon. You could actually have a popular referendum to eliminate the possibility of any future referendums, is what that means. You're using democracy to commit democracy suicide, basically, to say that we can, by popular vote, undo the idea of having popular votes. And what Michels points out in his argument is that, of course, you can't really make that bargain, because subsequent generations didn't agree to that, and they were in a sense entitled to the franchise before you did that, before you made that move. The problem, of course, is that this applies to all social contracts. The idea that we live under a social contract today because of the Constitution, well, none of us voted to ratify the Constitution here in America, because all of that happened 250, 300 years ago. All of the relevant debate and all the forces the historical forces that can converge to create that document, that social contract that might have been valid among the signatories, but it's not valid in the current day and age. What else? And here he explicitly lays it out. Bonapartism is the theory of individual dominion originating in the collective will, but tending to emancipate itself of that will and to become sovereign in its turn. In its democratic past, it finds a shield against the dangers which may threaten its anti-democratic present. In Bonapartism, the rule of Caesar, as was said by a wit of the last years of the Second Empire becomes a regular organ of the popular sovereignty. He will be democracy personified, the nation made man. It is a synthesis of the two antagonistic concepts, democracy and autocracy, which, as Michels has been talking about for this entire time, are not as far apart as we want to pretend that they are. That because democracy in practice, as he talks about, necessitates, in order for the whole electorate to have any power, that's never the case that the whole electorate has power. Groups have power. Organized groups have power, because organization, cooperation, collectivity, solidarity, it's the formation of those groups that give people the ability to affect the world and to seize power in reality, in tangible terms. And so how do you create so the oligarchy is a group, for example. They're an organized group. And they're a coherent organized group, and that's part of what gives them power, even though they're a minority. And that's the nature of minoritarian rule. And so in order to challenge that, you need a political party structure. Political party has to become an organized group. And so within the context of democracy, you therefore get autocracy and oligarchy, because the party naturally produces that as its existence goes on, as we've been talking about through the course of this book. Okay. So we'll keep going here. So this is interesting. The psychology of democracy, and that okay. So I just kind of made what I was just saying was sort of to part of an argument that the lines between aristocracy and democracy are blurred. But what the real argument is there is that the difference is one of aesthetic, of trappings, of how what is the culture, what is the presentation of this form. So we don't present our political forms as aristocratic anymore. We present them as democratic, even though they are aristocratic in content. They may be colored by some democratic stylings, but they're ultimately aristocratic. And as Michels pointed out in the very first introduction that we talked about, even the aristocracy of his time has become more democratic in form. Those elements of, like, which really what that means, it's a challenge to the hereditary order, the creation of oligarchies that are not bound by heredity and bloodline. That was the major shift of liberalism. But that didn't mean like egalitarianism. It meant the formation of new oligarchies that were more subtle, more nuanced, and actually more complex and better adapted to pass themselves on and to act as a form of the dead dominating the living, which is what all oligarchies do. And so even though we kind of have blurred that line, what's important is, or what the main difference is the style, is the aesthetic. How do we conceive of psychologically what the nature of the rulership over us is in these days? So in the past, it was the divine right of kings. What do we conceive of it now? And so on page 216, Michels says, "It was a tenet of the old aristocracy that to disobey the orders of the monarch was to sin against God. In modern democracy, it is held that no one may disobey the orders of the oligarchs, for in so doing, the people sin against themselves, defying their own will, spontaneously transferred by them to their representatives, and thus infringing democratic principle." And so the idea is that representative democracy, if we actually buy into that premise, the people have ceded their popular will to the representative by electing them. They have, by the means of popular sovereignty, by popular referendum, given up their power and vested it in the representative. And once you've agreed to do that, you've agreed by popular decision. Any one person or group of people who decides to go against the dictates or the rulership of the oligarchs as elected would therefore be violating the will of the people themselves, even if like a majority rises up against that person, because that's you're violating the system that we've all agreed upon, and we've all agreed to rule by. But it's interesting. It's like we can see that transmutation in the modern day. That no one. I mean, it's actually kind of funny because maybe in the case of Donald Trump, people would have said by challenging him, "You are going against God." But that's a very small minority of people who think things like that. For the vast majority, what do the elected leaders say? They say, "We have a mandate. We have a mandate from the people." And so they blunt the criticisms of the people by appealing to the same to that. This is why Michels talks in the beginning about the ethical embellishments of struggle, and why all of these political movements always speak in the language of the good of the entire human race. And so all American politicians, and indeed the Democrats of all of the Western world, always speak in the language of being for the whole people, being for the whole system, the whole republic. That's who they are standing on behalf of. And then by implication, the people opposing them are against that. Okay. What do we have here? Page 217. In practice, however, the election of the leaders, and above all their re-election, is affected by such methods and under the influence of suggestions and other methods of coercion so powerful that the freedom of choice of the masses is considerably impaired. In the history of party life, it is undeniable that the democratic system is reduced in ultimate analysis to the right of the masses, at stated intervals, to choose masters to whom, in the interim, they owe unconditional obedience. And that is more or less the form. That's the result of representative democracy. That is the sum total of your rights and freedoms as part of the franchise, is the right to choose your master at intervals that have been designated long before you were born or long before you signed any contract or agreed to any of this. That is the right it provided to you in democracy. And in most people's minds, in practice, that's basically what it is. And most people in the United States, or not most people, but a plurality of people, more so than any one political faction in the United States, are non-voters who have ceded that ability entirely, because choosing between a selection of different masters doesn't interest them. And why would it? Because they're almost the smarter ones, because they've recognized that this is not that representative democracy undermines what Rousseau called true democracy. The ideals of democracy are undermined by the practice of democracy. And it's same basic principles that we've been talking about. Whenever a new current of opposition manifests itself within the party, the leaders immediately endeavor to discredit it with a charge of demagogy. In this connection, that the leaders who hold in their hands all the mechanism of power have the advantage of being able to assume the aureole of legality, whereas the masses or the subordinate leaders who are in rebellion can always be placed in the unfavorable light of illegality. The magical phrase with which the leaders invariably succeed in stifling embarrassing opposition is the term the general interest. So again, leader identifying themselves with the general interest, with the mandate of the whole masses, of the whole people, with all of the republic, and how any move against the leadership, legitimate or illegitimate, good or bad, whenever there's an opposing faction or an opposing leader, as we talked about in the last time, usually it's not that you get these revolts from the whole of the masses, because what would that even mean? The masses are disorganized, they're atomized. They have to form into a faction and create leaders in order to effectively oppose the current oligarchs. And so whenever those people arise, the current oligarch uses the veil of legality, what is legality but appealing to the current status quo has designated that we are in charge. The rules that we have all made up and that we preserve, and that are completely, the rules that are completely to our own interest, these are what legitimize us. And so, that's pretty much the end of the chapter on Bonapartism. We'll cover a couple more, but it's the idea that the leader is no longer divine. They're no longer the product of a bloodline. Or if they are divine, it's divine. It's the divinity comes from the masses themselves. The sacredness of rule is the sacredness of democratic institutions. It's the moral high ground of having elected someone through democratic means and through a system of rules which are assumed a priori to be just, and just simply the management of expressing the will of a free people, which, as we've seen through the past 4 parts, is in practice. And he talks about the mechanisms of power at the hands of the leaders. They also have power of the press. They have the power of the purse. They have the power of heading the bureaucracy, especially if it's financial bureaucracy upon which people depend for their very existence. If the party's paying them, and that's what they, that's how they that's how they get their daily bread. Or if the leaders become elected, and therefore what's important is that they've maneuvered through the political system to a position of power. Now that they have that power, you've ceded it to them, they no longer directly answer to you for a variety of reasons. And so, as we've seen in practice, the system is not simply a spontaneous manifestation of the will of the people. What it is what democracy ends up doing is simply opening up. It's liberalism, and all of its forms is always an act of breaking up an old or hereditary system of rule, just smashing an old tradition and opening up new avenues to become the new aristocracy. Liberalism never erased the concept of aristocracy, it simply attacked the existing aristocracy and allowed for more mobility between the social castes. It liquefied the social caste structure and made it malleable, but it didn't do away with the social caste structure or class structure, whatever you might call it. Because I have like cool lights in here, I'm gonna change up the lighting just for fun. I don't know if anyone. I wonder if it's that guy from the Discord server who's watching. Ask if they have any color preference. I'll see if they get back to me. In the meantime, I will. No? Okay. No color preference. Let's go with green. We'll do green, and what do we have back here? Cool. Sweet. Yeah. Fuck yeah. That's way cooler. Okay. So yeah, why wouldn't I just do that every time? Well, I'm not always going to be streaming in this room. I'm in the band room because I'm going to be rehearsing later. And I have Wi-Fi in here and a whole mini fridge, and you can see the past grill cloths from we like to use a paint pen on the some of the gear. So that's like some speaker cabinet artwork done by Jeff Klein. Let's see the lady stabbing the guy in the neck, murking him in the neck. But yeah, he just did that with a projector and a paint pen. That's old. The ones behind me, that's like a... Yeah, those both were old cloths for on there. That's like, you can see it's supposed to be sort of the victim from True Detective on the right there. Of course, like a flying demon head. Yeah, it's cool. It's cool to have artwork on your speaker cabinets. It's like original artwork. Because who has that? We do. Oh man, this is cool because the book has a yellow tint to it now when I'm looking at it. So, related chapter, and I guess we'll finish out part 3 today, because this is the final chapter of part 3, which is identification of the party with the leader. Le parti c'est moi. That is French for "I am the Senate," to quote Emperor Palpatine. Or rather, it's "I am the party," but you know what I'm saying. So we have seen that in their struggle against their enemies within the party, the leaders of the labor movement pursue a tactic and adopt an attitude differing very little from those of the bourgeois government in its struggle with subversive elements. The terminology which the powers that be employ is mutatis mutandis, identical in the two cases. And so, again, Michels is making reference to the fact that the way that the party leadership talks about the rank and file of the party and how the Socialist Party leaders credit themselves with forestalling the revolution and how they're holding back the radical, the surging waters of social revolution, that they're the dam holding that back, basically. And they speak of the dissident parts of their party or the rival factions within their party as agitators or demagogues. And those are the main theories purveyed by the bourgeois establishment as to why these social revolutions happen. It's not because people have a deeply felt need to ameliorate their popular immiseration. No, it's because some agitator has come and riled them up, right? That normally they would be fine. These people would be fine just working, tilling the earth, taking home a modest wage while we live in opulence. It's the awareness that has been brought to them of their position by these agitators who are trying to rile them up and make it seem worse than it even is. That's the typical maneuver of the bourgeois, is to call all their leaders simply agitators. But what Michels is pointing out, the people who run the parties, including socialist parties, the people who are the current leaders speak exactly the same way about the people within their party who challenge their power. They say, you're an agitator, you're a demagogue. Page 221. And so remember, this is a chapter that is about identifying yourself with the party. I am the party. He says, the bureaucrat identifies himself completely with the organization, confounding his own interests with its interests. All objective criticism of the party is taken by him as a personal affront. This is the cause of the obvious incapacity of all party leaders to take a serene and just view of hostile criticism. The leader declares himself personally offended, doing this partly in good faith, but in part deliberately, in order to shift the battleground so that he can present himself as the harmless object of an unwarrantable attack and arouse in the minds of his masses of the masses towards his opponents in matters of theory, that antipathy which is always felt by those for those whose actions are directed by personal rancor. God, I butchered reading that sentence, but that was a fucking abortion of a sentence. I don't know why I picked it out to read it. I guess it was easier to read in my head than out loud. So the bureaucrat identifies himself completely with the organization. This is a consequence. It's an artifact of the same thing we're talking about in the past section of when the reporter or the journalist doing anonymous work on behalf of the party dispatch or the party newspaper. He becomes simply identified with the prestige and the veracity and the trust that people have with the organization. But that's a two-way street. So the bureaucrat, he comes to identify himself totally with the party, just as the party is identified with the bureaucratic caste. The interests of the party become identified with the bureaucratic caste. He's not strictly speaking about the leaders. He is talking about the leaders, but he means not just the people who hold a party membership, but the people who work, say, the people in modern day, the people who work at the DNC or the RNC, the staffers, the people who are the strategists, the people who are serving as the chair or as the vice chairs of the DNC or the RNC, the people at the DCCC who control the fundraising money that goes out to candidates in state and local races all across the country. All the people who are working at all these different levels, who have built their entire career around the party, they've come to identify with the party. Why? Well, that's because the party becomes their employer. And so, as we've seen, that's a coercive relationship that makes them dependent on the party and makes them identify with the party. It becomes their identity because they don't, when that's your professional career, especially if you came in Michels' time, he's writing about people who often came from being manual laborers and then strictly through the party, the training they received through the party and the work that they did through the party, working their way up into the bureaucratic organs of the Socialist Party. And then what? You're going to go back to becoming a manual laborer? No, you're going to want to preserve your position and your status. And so all of these incentives basically get the people who are doing the management of the day-to-day affairs of the party and controlling the levers of power in the party come to identify themselves with it. And they come to identify the leader with the party, the leaders with the party as well, because of the principle of the leader's indispensability, and because of the psychological things we were just talking about with Bonapartism, of this yearning to have a monarch that is the embodiment of the will of the people. because that's what you really. I think there's a perception, and Michels doesn't talk about this so much, but as to why Bonapartism arises. I mean, he's talking about all the social, political, and structural reasons why these aristocracies form, but as to why the idea of autocracy is so attractive, and it is exactly because I think there is the perception that that is the easiest way, the most direct way to smash through these entrenched power structures is with an autocrat by throwing out the rules and saying, "Fuck all your limitations on the power of the executive." Because those are all self-serving for the people who are in the current executive, we're going to smash through all that. And so there's a yearning for someone who can do that, for the power. A lot of what he's talking about here in political parties is how the left wing perceives how all of the right wing power structures grant them the ability to accomplish a great deal that the people as a disorganized mass cannot do. And so they have to replicate the power. They have to fight fire with fire, and they have to replicate the power of the right wing to challenge the right wing. But in doing so, you end up creating this idea of the Bonaparte, of the divine dictator that is the avatar of the people, for good or for ill. It might be that person gets away with murder or gets away with worse than that because they're being invested with more moral authority than perhaps even was given to kings. Page 222, he says, the despotism of the leaders does not arise solely from a vulgar lust of power or from uncontrolled egoism, but is often the outcome of a profound and sincere conviction of their own value and of the services which they have rendered to the common cause. The bureaucracy which is most faithful and most efficient in the discharge of its duties is also the most dictatorial. That's pretty self-explanatory. But it's again, that principle that moving towards more effectiveness, more efficiency, and the more faithful you create the inner cartel or clique within your party, the more faithful they are to the cause, the more dictatorial they become because they're more convinced of their moral rightness. And so, if they get pushback from, some local party assembly full of the rank and file of the party, saying, no, actually, when you tell us not to strike for strategic reasons, even though you may have been playing the political game for so long and you made that determination, we think we have to strike, and we're going to strike anyway. The party begins to see behavior like that from the masses as as self-sabotaging, and that these people don't know what's best for them, that we have look at all we've done for them and look at what these ingrates are how they're behaving. That these are the kind of dynamics that are established. Indeed, I didn't even, I guess I did just read this. Maybe it was just in my mind, but page 223, he talks about the right to strike. So the fact that I decided to use that example, I guess, is apropos. He says, in the conflict between the leaders and the rank and file of the German trade unions regarding the right to strike, the leaders have more than once maintained that the decision in this matter is morally and legally reserved for themselves, because it is they who provide the financial resources which enable the workers to remain on strike. This view is no more than the ultimate consequence of that oligarchical mode of thought which inevitably leads to a complete forgetfulness of true democratic principles. And that's it. We'll call the end of part 3 there. Man, it's not even 40 minutes, so I might talk maybe the first chapter or 2 of part 4. That says it all. The reserving for yourself the right to strike, again, because they have they're the ones who are bearing the financial burden. They're the ones who are allowing the strike to happen. If indeed it does happen, the funds will be dispensed to the party to pay, create the strike fund to pay for this. And so that creates that dependency, and that creates the situation where the leaders would say to the party, you're dependent on us. Oh, what's up, man?
What's up?
Well, I guess I'll end it now because I got hoop in here.
Oh, go ahead. I've still got some shit that I got to do to my drum set.
Oh, no, you're all good. That was perfect because we were at the end of the part.
What's up?
What's up, bro?
What's up, YouTube? Getting faded on coffee.
Getting faded?
Yeah, bro.
That's the opposite of what should happen on coffee.
Oh, man, you got to get coffee faded.
All right, well, that's perfect, actually. So, all right, all y'all motherfuckers, I'll see you later.